All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today, we're taking a deep dive into a film that's stirred up quite a bit of controversy over the years. Child Bride came out in 1938, and it tried to, well, expose the tough reality of child marriage, particularly in rural America.
Interesting.
And the really cool thing is we've got more than just the film itself to explore. We've got years and years worth of user reviews, all thanks to the Internet Archive.
Cool, wow.
Yeah, and you can see how opinions have shifted over time. Some folks saw it as like a brave statement, a real social commentary, but others, they criticized it, saying it was exploitative and even saying it went against the Hollywood self-censorship rules back then.
It's amazing to see how a film's reception can change like that, isn't it? What might have been seen as groundbreaking back then could be viewed very differently now, especially when you consider how we think about these sensitive topics, like child marriage or how young girls are shown on screen.
Exactly, and that's what makes this deep dive so intriguing. So to get us started, let's set the scene a bit. The film follows the school teacher. She's desperately trying to stop older men from marrying young girls in her community, a very rural community.
Ah, I see.
Now, some of the reviewers, they felt that the film, even though it could be a little over the top sometimes, captured a certain authenticity about rural life, particularly during the Depression.
It's fascinating because the film, even though it's fictional, it taps into these very real anxieties people had back then. The Depression hit rural communities hard, really hard, and people were driven to desperate measures. So yeah, the film might exaggerate things for dramatic effect, but it does reflect a reality where economic hardship could push people towards practices that we now consider, well, really abhorrent.
And then, of course, there's the casting of Shirley Mills. She was only 12 years old during filming. That's caused a lot of controversy over the years. Although it's worth mentioning that Shirley herself later said she was actually older, maybe trying to distance herself from all the debate surrounding it.
It's almost as if the film's legacy got tangled up with her own personal story,
Right.
and it raises questions about the filmmaker's intentions. Did they exploit Shirley, even if their goal was to expose exploitation? It's a tough question.
Really tough. And speaking of tough questions, we can't ignore the infamous skinny dipping scene, can we? It's almost become synonymous with the film itself. And the opinions on it are, well, they're all over the place. Some reviewers argue that it wasn't meant to be gratuitous, it's there for shock value. They say it was meant to highlight the villain's, well, predatory nature.
Some viewers saw it as a way to symbolize the young girl's transition to womanhood, with the villain kind of leering and emphasizing that power imbalance.
Right, but of course there were others who found it completely unnecessary and potentially exploitative, regardless of what the filmmakers intended. And this is where the Hays Code comes in. Just a reminder, for those who might not know, it was basically Hollywood's way of censoring itself back in the 1930s. It dictated what they considered morally acceptable to show on screen.
Yeah, the Hays Code was super strict about nudity and anything even remotely suggestive. So the fact that Child Bride, which was an independent film, even included a scene like that, it's pretty remarkable. It makes you wonder if the filmmakers were intentionally pushing boundaries, using the film to challenge the moral standards of the time. Were they exploiting a loophole or making a statement? It's hard to say for sure.
And that's what makes this deep dive so compelling. We're not just looking at a film, we're uncovering this cultural time capsule. We're getting a glimpse into a society wrestling with these changing norms, all these anxieties. And this film, in many ways, embodies those anxieties.
Exactly. Don't forget, this was the era of the Great Depression. Social and economic upheaval everywhere. Traditional values were being questioned left and right, and the film, whether intentionally or not, reflects those tensions, those cracks in what was considered acceptable at the time.
It's like the film is whispering to us across all those years, inviting us to think about how much has really changed and how much is still uncomfortably similar to what we see today.
And that actually leads perfectly into another layer of this whole thing. Several reviewers pointed out how starkly the film portrays rural communities, themes of poverty, limited education, a lack of opportunity, all of that.
Yeah, some reviewers felt the film was accurate, that it showed the hard realities so many rural Americans faced during the Depression. But others, they saw it as playing into harmful stereotypes, further pushing those communities to the margins.
And here's where it gets really interesting. One reviewer even compared the film's setting to things that still happen today, pointing to communities where child exploitation still exists, often hidden behind tradition or cultural norms.
It's a chilling reminder that these issues aren't just relics of the past. The film becomes this lens through which we can look at our own society, asking ourselves some tough questions about how far we've come, but also how much further we need to go.
Right? That connection to the present day is so important. It takes the conversation beyond just analyzing a film from the 1930s and forces us to think about the bigger picture. Are we just observing history, or are we actually confronting uncomfortable truths about the world we live in right now?
Now, before we get too serious, I gotta mention some of the more, shall we say, quirky things reviewers picked up on.
Oh, yeah.
There's this character, Angelo, he's a dwarf, and then there's this scene with goats at a funeral, of all places.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
And of course, the reviewers who were convinced the film was breaking all these Hays Code rules, they really latched onto those details.
It's funny how those seemingly random details can actually add to a film's impact.
Right,
They make you stop and think, like, what was the meaning behind that?
right.
Sometimes the smallest things can reveal a lot about the bigger picture.
It's those little things that stay with you, make you wonder what the filmmakers were trying to say, what messages they might have snuck in there.
It's like a puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
And as we dig through these reviews, we'll try to piece that puzzle together. One thing that keeps popping up is this idea that child marriage, at least in the context of the film, was often driven by this skewed gender ratio and this desperate need to grow communities, to have more children.
Reviewers debated whether that portrayal was accurate or if it was just a harmful stereotype.
That's a good point.
On the one hand, the film might be trying to show a specific reality of that time where, because of things like skewed gender ratios and economic desperation, people ended up doing things that even then were ethically questionable.
Right.
But then, on the other hand, it runs the risk of oversimplifying a complex issue. It could reduce these communities to caricatures defined by their worst impulses. It makes you wonder, how can art both reflect and shapes how we understand different communities and cultures? Is Child Bride actually offering a nuanced view of rural life during the Depression, or is it just perpetuating harmful stereotypes?
Yeah, it's a tightrope walk for any filmmaker, isn't it? Do you go for authenticity, even if it means you might reinforce some negative stereotypes? Or do you avoid showing certain realities because you're afraid of how people will judge you? Child Bride definitely doesn't shy away from anything. Maybe that's why it still gets such strong reactions all these years later.
Yeah, it's a film that just begs to be discussed, to be picked apart, debated. And speaking of debate, remember that reviewer who was absolutely convinced that Child Bride violated the Hays Code like a dozen times?
Oh, yeah, yeah. They were laser focused on that whole implication that the school teacher might be living with a man she wasn't married to. The Hays Code was really strict about anything that even hinted at immoral behavior.
They even brought up the fact that a character drinks unpasteurized milk in one scene. Like that was somehow pushing the boundaries of decency back then. It seems kind of crazy now, but it shows how much things have changed. What was scandalous in 1938 might seem totally normal today.
Absolutely. And the reverse is true too, right? Makes you wonder how Child Bride would be received if it came out today. Would people be outraged? Or would they see it as a historical piece, a product of its time?
That's a great question, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot. I mean, on the one hand, we've come a long way when it comes to recognizing and addressing child marriage and exploitation. We've got stricter laws, more awareness, and way more resources dedicated to protecting children.
But on the other hand, some parts of the film, like that skinny dipping scene and the way rural communities are portrayed, well, those might be even more sensitive now. I mean, think about today's cultural climate.
Yeah, I think the nudity would definitely spark a huge debate. We're a lot more aware of the potential for exploitation. And even if the filmmakers had good intentions, using a 12-year-old girl in a scene like that, I think people would condemn it.
It's a good reminder that artistic expression, well, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's always going to be influenced by the social norms and sensitivities of the time. What was considered acceptable, even groundbreaking back then, might be seen as harmful or exploitative now.
It's a conversation that never really ends, does it? And it makes you wonder how future generations are going to judge the films and art we make today.
Makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
One reviewer made a point that I found really interesting. They were saying that while the film condemns child marriage, it doesn't actually offer any solutions or alternatives.
Oh, yeah. They felt like the film was more about shocking the audience than actually exploring the social and economic factors that led to these practices in the first place.
Almost like it's saying, look how awful this is, but it doesn't really delve into the why or how to prevent it.
Yeah, that's a fair critique. The film might raise awareness, but does it actually empower people to do anything about it, to challenge those deeply ingrained social norms?
That's a question worth pondering. Does art have a responsibility to not just expose injustice, but to inspire change? Or is it enough to just hold up a mirror to society and let people draw their own conclusions?
Really makes you think. So let's shift gears for a minute and talk about how the school teacher is portrayed, the one who's fighting against child marriage.
Oh, she's such an interesting character. She's
Yeah.
like a beacon of hope, a symbol of progress in this system that feels so oppressive and unfair.
A lot of the reviewers really admired her determination and courage, especially considering that women's voices were often silenced or dismissed back then.
She embodies female agency and empowerment. And it adds this whole other layer of complexity to the film, right? On one hand, you have this young girl being taken advantage of, but on the other, you have this strong, independent woman fighting for what's right.
It creates this kind of tension within the film. It highlights how differently women were viewed and treated during that time.
Exactly. And it also makes you think about the role of education, right? How education, especially for girls, can challenge harmful traditions and give people the power to break free from these oppressive social structures. The school teacher really embodies that transformative power.
It makes me think about how, even today, in so many parts of the world, access to education, especially for girls, is still a huge problem. It's a reminder that the fight for equality and empowerment is far from over.
It's a battle that transcends time and place, and that brings us back to that reviewer who connected the film's setting to what's happening today, in places where child exploitation is still a reality.
Yeah, they argued that while the film might be set in a very specific time and place, the themes it explores are universal.
They made the point that poverty, lack of education, isolation, all those things create an environment where exploitation can thrive no matter where you are or what your cultural background is.
It's a sobering reminder that progress isn't always a straight line. Even as we make progress in some areas, there are still corners of society where vulnerable people are at risk.
It's a call to action, a reminder that we can't just sit back and think everything's fine. We have to stay vigilant, keep pushing for change, and make sure everyone, especially the most vulnerable, has the chance to live a life of dignity and safety.
That's a powerful message. So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into Child Bride, I want to bring up one last point that came up in several reviews. A lot of reviewers, they kept comparing Child Bride to other films from that same era, especially those that tackled, social issues. And some felt it wasn't as subtle, not as nuanced as those other films dealing with similar themes.
Yeah, they pointed out how Child Bride often relies on melodrama and shock value, hitting you over the head with things. And they felt like that might have actually weakened the message a bit.
One reviewer even compared it to Grapes of Wrath, that classic film about rural poverty during the Depression. They said Grapes of Wrath had this greater sense of empathy, of really understanding the human experience.
It's interesting to think about how different filmmakers approach these tough topics, isn't it? Some go for that more sensational style, trying to really grab the audience's attention, get a reaction.
Right. While others are more subtle, they focus on character development, making it feel emotionally real.
Yeah, and there's no right or wrong way, is there? It's an artistic choice, depends on what the filmmaker's trying to do.
But it does make you wonder if Child Bride might have been more effective if it hadn't been quite so, well, sensational.
Maybe. But then again, maybe it wouldn't have caused as much controversy and debate. Maybe that shock value was what it took to get people talking about those issues back in 1938.
It's like they say, there's no such thing as bad publicity.
I think it's more complicated than that. I mean, art can reflect society and shape it at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And while Child Bride might not be perfect, there's no doubt it got people talking about child marriage and exploitation.
Absolutely. It brought those issues out into the open, even if it did it in a way that might seem, well, insensitive now.
That's the thing about looking at art from different times, isn't it? It makes us see things through the lens of that era, while also recognizing how much our own views have changed.
It reminds us that progress, it's not a finish line, it's a journey. And even as we try to create a more just world, we're always going to be wrestling with the complexities of the past.
Well said. And as we wrap up our deep dive into Child Bride, I want to leave you with something to think about.
Okay, shoot.
Does Child Bride still hold up as a piece of social commentary? Or does its portrayal of young girls, which some might find problematic, ultimately overshadow its message?
That's a tough one. And I think it's something each viewer has to grapple with on their own. That's part of what makes this film so fascinating, so thought-provoking.
It's a film that continues to challenge us decades later, makes us confront uncomfortable truths, examine our values, recognize the complexities of history.
It reminds us that art, well, it never really ends, does it? It keeps evolving, keeps speaking to people long after the credits roll, sparking new conversations, making us challenge our perspectives.
That's the power of art.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, folks, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
And until next time, keep those brains buzzing.